I never imagined my wedding day would end with my fiancée walking down the aisle toward my brother instead of me. Caitlin and I had been together for 3 years planning our perfect future when she decided Jackson was actually her soulmate. What hurt even more than their betrayal was watching my parents embrace them both, tears of joy in their eyes, as they welcomed their favorite son and his new bride into the family right in front of me. 2 years later, the irony was almost poetic when Caitlin called me desperate for help escaping the controlling behavior she once found so charming. Drop a comment, letting me know where you are watching from, and hit that subscribe button to join me on this journey of betrayal, heartbreak, and ultimately redemption. Growing up as the younger brother to Jackson in our suburban Chicago home was an exercise in invisibility. 3 years my senior Jackson possessed the kind of natural charisma that drew people in like moths to flame. Tall, athletic, and effortlessly confident, he was the golden child in our parents' eyes from day one. While I struggled through awkward adolescence with braces and acne, Jackson glided through high school as student body president and captain of the baseball team. Our childhood was marked by a pattern I only recognized fully in adulthood. Anything I showed interest in or achieved would inevitably become the focus of Jackson's attention. When I joined the school newspaper in 9th grade and discovered a passion for writing, Jackson suddenly became editor-in-chief the following year. When I saved for 6 months to buy a vintage record player for my room, Jackson convinced our parents he needed a professional turntable setup for his budding interest in music production. The most painful example came during my junior year of high school. After months of working up the courage, I had finally asked Melissa, my crush since freshman year, to prom. She said yes, and for 3 wonderful weeks I floated on air. Then, inexplicably, she canceled on me, looking uncomfortable and making vague excuses. I discovered the truth when I came home to find Melissa and Jackson studying together in our living room. By prom night, they were officially a couple, with my brother magnanimously offering me their extra ticket to join their friend group. Throughout these incidents, my parents consistently took Jackson's side. "Your brother is just more outgoing, sweetheart," my mother would explain when I expressed hurt. "You could learn something from his initiative," my father would add, completely missing the pattern of behavior. When I pointed out the obvious, they would accuse me of jealousy and sibling rivalry. Despite these challenges, I worked hard to carve out my own identity. I chose a college across the country, deliberately selecting a school Jackson had no interest in. Those 4 years gave me the space to discover who I was outside my brother's shadow. I majored in architecture, developed genuine friendships, and gradually built my confidence. After graduation, I accepted a position at a respected firm in Denver, putting physical distance between myself and my family's dynamics. I was 27 when I met Caitlin at a mutual friend's housewarming party. She had just moved to Denver for a position as an art curator at a local gallery. With warm brown eyes, a quick laugh, and an encyclopedic knowledge of obscure films, she captivated me immediately. We spent the entire evening in conversation, discovering shared interests in mid-century design, hiking Colorado's trails, and a mutual obsession with creating the perfect sandwich. Our connection felt different from any relationship I had experienced before. Caitlin listened intently when I spoke, remembered details about my projects at work, and seemed genuinely interested in my perspectives. Unlike previous relationships where I had felt the need to impress or perform with Caitlin, I could simply be myself. Our first date extended from coffee to lunch to an impromptu gallery visit, ending with stargazing from my apartment rooftop. By our third date, I knew this relationship was something special. Within 6 months, we were practically inseparable, spending weekends exploring mountain towns or curled up with books in her apartment filled with eclectic art pieces. When I cautiously shared stories about my complicated relationship with Jackson, Caitlin responded with empathy rather than dismissal. "That sounds really difficult," she said, holding my hand across the dinner table. "Family dynamics can leave deep wounds, and what you're describing sounds like a lifetime of having your boundaries violated." Her validation of my experience brought tears to my eyes. I had grown so accustomed to having my feelings dismissed. As our relationship deepened, Caitlin integrated seamlessly into my life in Denver. We built a community of friends, established favorite restaurants, and created rituals that anchored our relationship. Weekend hikes, followed by visits to our favorite bookstore, Sunday morning pancake competitions, and monthly culture nights, where we would alternate introducing each other to films, music, or books. After 2 years together, I proposed during a sunset hike to a mountain lake. Caitlin's joyful yes echoed across the water, and we spent the evening planning our future. A renovation project on a historic Denver home, potential career moves, and someday, children who would grow up in a home filled with art books and unconditional love. Wedding planning began with genuine excitement and shared vision. We decided on a spring ceremony at a renovated historic barn outside Denver, with a reception that would showcase local cuisine and musicians. Every decision felt collaborative and joyful as we designed invitations, selected music, and discussed vows. The first crack in our happiness appeared when I introduced Caitlin to my family during Thanksgiving, 6 months before our planned wedding. While my parents were cordial, their enthusiasm seemed restrained compared to their reaction to Jackson's previous girlfriends. Jackson, however, showed an unprecedented interest in my fiancée, complimenting her extensively and dominating conversation with questions about her work and background. "Your brother is so charming," Caitlin remarked as we drove back to our hotel that night. "You never mentioned how engaging he is." Something in her tone set off a faint alarm, but I pushed the feeling aside. Of course, Jackson would be on his best behavior with Caitlin. It was his pattern to shine in social situations. As wedding preparations progressed, my parents began suggesting increased involvement from Jackson. "He has such great taste, dear," my mother commented during a discussion about reception decor. "And he knows everyone in the Chicago event planning scene through his work," my father added, referencing Jackson's marketing career. Initially, Caitlin politely declined these suggestions, preserving our vision for the wedding. However, as the date approached, she began mentioning ideas Jackson suggested with increasing frequency. When I expressed concern about his involvement, Caitlin assured me she was simply being courteous to my family. "I want them to feel included, especially since the wedding is happening in Colorado instead of Chicago," she explained. "Plus, Jackson has some really creative ideas. Did you know he suggested this amazing florist who could do custom arrangements based on where we had our first date?" The fact that Jackson knew where we had our first date, a detail I was sure I hadn't shared with him, raised additional red flags. But confronting Caitlin only led to reassurances that she was handling everything and that I should focus on my current high-stress project at work. In the final weeks before the wedding, Caitlin traveled to Chicago twice for what she described as family bonding and final wedding details. She returned from these trips, subdued, but blamed it on wedding stress and exhaustion. Our normally open communication began to feel strained. Several times I entered rooms to find her quickly ending phone calls, and she began keeping her phone face down, a new habit that stood out in our typically transparent relationship. The night before our wedding, my parents hosted the rehearsal dinner at an upscale restaurant in downtown Denver. Throughout the evening, I noticed lingering glances between Caitlin and Jackson, followed by swift aversions of eyes when I looked their way. My brother gave an elaborate toast that focused strangely on his own relationship with Caitlin, describing inside jokes I had never heard and shared experiences I hadn't been part of. My parents beamed proudly during his speech, while I felt increasingly like an outsider in my own engagement. After dinner, Caitlin claimed she needed to handle a last-minute detail with the wedding coordinator and disappeared for nearly an hour. When she returned, her eyes were rimmed with red, which she attributed to allergies, despite the fact that I had never known her to suffer from them. That night, breaking with tradition, she insisted on staying with her bridesmaids rather than returning to our apartment. "It will make tomorrow more special," she said, kissing me briefly before hurrying to her waiting Uber. I spent my last night as a bachelor alone in our apartment, fighting a growing sense of dread that I could neither justify nor dispel. The morning of what should have been the happiest day of my life dawned clear and bright. The historic barn venue was transformed with wildflower arrangements and twinkling lights exactly as we had envisioned. I arrived early with my groomsmen, joking nervously as we adjusted boutonnieres and straightened ties. My parents appeared tense when they arrived, my mother clutching my father's arm with unusual intensity, but I attributed their behavior to normal wedding day emotions. As 200 guests filled the rows of white chairs in the garden where our ceremony would take place, I took my position at the front with the officiant, my best friend Ryan, at my side as best man. The string quartet began playing the processional music we had selected together, and the bridesmaids emerged one by one, walking down the aisle in the sage green dresses Caitlin had chosen. Then the music shifted to our carefully selected bride's entrance song. The guests rose, turning expectantly toward the barn doors. My heart pounded with anticipation, eager for that first glimpse of Caitlin in her wedding dress. The doors opened, and my world collapsed. There stood Caitlin, radiant in her wedding gown, but her arm was linked with Jackson's. My brother, dressed not in his groomsman's attire, but in a matching groom's tuxedo, led her down the aisle while she gazed adoringly at him. The guests murmured in confusion, heads swiveling between me at the altar and the approaching couple. When they reached the front, Jackson spoke loudly enough for everyone to hear. "We have an announcement to make," he said, squeezing Caitlin's hand. "Sometimes life presents us with unexpected truths, and we must be brave enough to follow our hearts. Caitlin and I have fallen deeply in love, and we cannot deny what we feel for each other." Caitlin, tears streaming down her face, nodded. "I am so sorry for the pain this causes, but Jackson and I realized we are soulmates. We never meant for this to happen, but we cannot fight these feelings." I stood frozen in shock, unable to process the nightmare unfolding before me. The officiant stepped back, clearly unsure how to proceed. Ryan moved protectively to my side, placing a steadying hand on my shoulder. The guests erupted in shocked whispers and exclamations. What happened next was perhaps even more devastating. My parents rose from their front row seats and moved forward to embrace Jackson and Caitlin. "We support you both," my mother announced, wiping away what appeared to be tears of joy. My father clapped Jackson on the back proudly. In that moment, I understood that this was no impulsive decision. This betrayal had been planned perhaps for months, with my parents' knowledge and apparent blessing. Alexander, my father, addressed me using my full name, as he did when delivering pronouncements. "I know this is difficult, but sometimes these things happen for the best. Your brother and Caitlin have a special connection we all recognized immediately." I found my voice at last, though it came out strangled and raw. "You knew about this. You all planned this public humiliation. Don't be so dramatic," Jackson replied with the condescending smile I had known my entire life. "We wanted to be honest. Caitlin and I tried to fight our feelings, but some connections are just too powerful to deny." Unable to endure another moment of this cruelty, I turned and walked out of the garden, past the confused and pitying faces of guests, past the elaborate decorations we had chosen together, past the life I thought I was about to begin. Ryan and a few loyal friends followed me, forming a protective circle as I stumbled to my car. "Let me drive you home," Ryan insisted, taking my keys. As we pulled away, I caught a final glimpse in the side mirror, the ceremony apparently continuing with Jackson in my place at the altar. 3 days after the wedding disaster, my parents requested my presence at their hotel suite for what they called a family meeting. Against my better judgment and Ryan's explicit advice, I agreed to hear them out, desperately seeking some explanation that might make sense of the incomprehensible betrayal. My parents, Jackson and Caitlin, sat together on one side of the room, a united front against me. My mother began with what she clearly believed was a reasonable explanation. "Sweetheart, we understand you're hurt, but these things happen." When Jackson and Caitlin started spending time together during the wedding planning, they discovered they have so much in common, intellectually, artistically. It became clear to all of us that they are simply better suited. "Better suited," I repeated incredulously. "You encouraged my fiancée to leave me at the altar for my brother, and that's your explanation." Now Alexander, my father, interjected with the authoritative tone he used when ending disagreements. "Nobody planned for this to happen on your wedding day. That was unfortunate timing, but once they realized their feelings, it would have been dishonest to proceed with a marriage that wasn't meant to be. Jackson leaned forward, his expression a practiced mask of regret that did nothing to hide the triumph in his eyes. Bro, I never intended to hurt you. The heart wants what it wants. If anything, we saved you from years in a marriage that wasn't right. Someday you'll thank us for our honesty. Caitlin, who had been studying her hands, finally spoke. I truly cared for you, Alex, but what I feel for Jackson is different. It's more intense, more real. I never experienced this kind of connection before. As they spoke, I recognized the familiar pattern from my childhood. My perceptions were being dismissed, my feelings minimized, while Jackson was positioned as the reasonable party, even the hero of the situation. The gaslighting was so blatant, it was almost laughable, except for the devastating pain that accompanied it. Actually, my mother added in what she clearly thought was a conciliatory tone, we were hoping you might give a toast at their wedding. They're planning a small ceremony next month for those who couldn't attend the adjusted celebration. It would show such maturity on your part. The request was so outrageous, so completely detached from reality, that it finally broke through my shock. Are you serious? You want me to toast the relationship that began with the most humiliating betrayal of my life? No. This conversation is over. As I stood to leave, Jackson called after me. This attitude is exactly why Caitlin and I connect better. You always were too sensitive, too dramatic. If you could just be happy for us. I closed the door on his words, making a decision in that moment to close the door on all of them. The social aftermath was as painful as the betrayal itself. Our friends split into factions, with many taking the path of least resistance by accepting the new couple rather than standing on principle. The false narrative spread quickly that Caitlin and I had mutually decided to part ways, and that her relationship with Jackson began afterward, a fiction that was easier for many to accept than the brutal truth. Professionally, I faced additional complications. Caitlin and I shared many contacts in Denver's tight-knit art and architecture community. Several clients who had heard distorted versions of the story withdrew from projects, uncomfortable with the perceived drama. I began to feel like a pariah in the city I had made my home. Former friends who had witnessed the wedding debacle but subsequently accepted invitations to Jackson and Caitlin's proper ceremony stopped contacting me entirely. Others maintained uncomfortable, pitying friendships that felt worse than the outright abandonment. 2 weeks after our confrontation, my mother called to formally invite me to Jackson and Caitlin's wedding in Chicago. It would mean so much to the family, she insisted. People are beginning to talk about your absence from family functions. I will not be attending, I replied simply. This attitude is very disappointing, Alexander. Your father and I have always taught you to rise above petty feelings. Jackson is extending an olive branch here. An olive branch would be an apology, not an invitation to celebrate his betrayal. My refusal to attend the wedding became the final justification my parents needed to essentially cut contact. Until you can be supportive of your brother's happiness, perhaps we should take some space, my father announced in our last phone call. The irony of his concern for Jackson's happiness over mine was not lost on me. As Jackson and Caitlin exchanged vows with my parents' blessing, I began the difficult process of rebuilding a life that had been shattered by the people I trusted most. I sold our Denver apartment, unable to bear the memories it contained, and accepted a position with an architectural firm in Seattle. The physical distance provided space to begin healing, though the emotional wounds remained raw. The 2 years following the wedding day disaster were a slow, painful journey of reconstruction. Seattle's perpetual rain matched my mood for the first several months as I threw myself into work, taking on complex projects that required total focus and left little mental energy for dwelling on the past. My new colleagues knew nothing of my history, and I preferred it that way. I became known for my dedication, creativity, and professionalism, gradually building a reputation that was entirely my own, not defined in relation to a charismatic older brother or as part of a betrayed couple. 6 months into my Seattle life, at my therapist's insistence, I finally began to emerge socially. I joined an architectural photography group that met on weekends to document historic buildings around the city. The shared interest provided enough structure to make social interaction manageable without the pressure of pure socialization. Gradually, I developed genuine friendships with several group members. My therapist, Dr. Torres, was instrumental in helping me process the multi-layered trauma of the betrayal. What happened to you reflects their character, not your worth, she reminded me consistently. The pattern of family dynamics you've described shows a long-standing issue that predates your relationship with Caitlin. Through our weekly sessions, I began to recognize how my family system had conditioned me to accept mistreatment, to doubt my perceptions, and to prioritize others' needs above my own. These insights, while painful, provided a framework for understanding and eventually healing. By the second year, I had established a life that felt increasingly authentic. My apartment overlooking Lake Union became a sanctuary filled with books, architectural models, and photography that reflected my aesthetic rather than compromises with someone else's preferences. I advanced at work, leading a major restoration project for a historic theater that earned local recognition. Contact with my family dwindled to occasional text messages on birthdays and holidays. I heard about Jackson and Caitlin primarily through mutual acquaintances who didn't know better than to mention them. From these inadvertent updates, I gathered they had moved into a luxury downtown Chicago apartment, and that Jackson had leveraged family connections to secure Caitlin a position at a prestigious gallery. My parents, predictably, were frequent visitors. I had just returned from a site visit on a rainy Tuesday evening when my phone displayed an incoming call from a number I had deleted but still recognized instantly. Caitlin. My finger hovered over the decline button, but curiosity overrode self-protection. I answered with a neutral hello. Alex. Her voice sounded smaller than I remembered, with a tremor I had never heard before. I know I have no right to call you, but I need to talk to you, in person if possible. My immediate impulse was to refuse to protect myself from whatever new manipulation might be unfolding. I don't think that's a good idea, Caitlin. Please, she whispered the word, catching on what sounded like a suppressed sob. I wouldn't ask if it wasn't important. I can come to Seattle. A public place, wherever you feel comfortable. Against my better judgment and my therapist's likely advice, I agreed to meet her that weekend at a coffee shop near Pike Place Market, busy enough to ensure our conversation wouldn't become too emotional and public enough that I could leave easily if necessary. Saturday arrived, with unusual sunshine that felt mockingly cheerful given my apprehension. I arrived early, selecting a table with a clear path to the exit and ordering black coffee I didn't really want but needed as an occupation for my hands. When Caitlin entered, I almost didn't recognize her. The confident, vibrant woman I had known had been replaced by someone who moved hesitantly, her eyes darting around the space as if checking for threats. She had lost weight, and dark circles shadowed her eyes, despite careful attempts to conceal them with makeup. "Thank you for meeting me," she said, sliding into the chair across from me. Her hands trembled slightly as she placed them on the table. "Why are you here, Caitlin?" I asked, directly, unwilling to engage in pleasantries. She took a deep breath. "I needed to see you, because I owe you an apology, and because I need help." She paused, visibly gathering courage. "Jackson isn't the person I thought he was. Or maybe he is exactly who you always said he was, and I was too blinded to see it." What followed was a revelation that, despite everything I had not anticipated, according to Caitlin, the charming, attentive man who had pursued her during our engagement had transformed almost immediately after their wedding into a controlling, manipulative partner who isolated her from friends, monitored her communications, and criticized her constantly. "It started with small things," she explained, her voice barely above a whisper, "suggesting I change outfits before we went out, checking my phone while I was in the shower, making jokes about my friends that turned into reasons why I shouldn't see them." The isolation escalated gradually. Jackson convinced Caitlin to leave her curatorial position because the commute was too stressful and helped her secure a part-time role at a gallery owned by his friend role that conveniently required Jackson's approval for any major decisions. He has access to all my accounts, emails, social media, even banking. For simplicity, he said. I didn't realize I was being cut off from any independent means of communication until it was too late. The psychological manipulation became increasingly familiar, as she described it. The rewriting of events, the dismissal of her perceptions, the positioning of his controlling behavior as care and concern. When she attempted to discuss these issues with my parents, they reinforced Jackson's narrative. Your mother told me I was being ungrateful, that Jackson worked so hard to give me a beautiful life. Your father suggested I might need medication for anxiety when I tried to explain how controlled I felt. Tears filled her eyes as she reached the core of her confession. I made a terrible, unforgivable mistake, Alex. I was flattered by Jackson's attention, dazzled by his charm, and too weak to resist when he pursued me. I betrayed you in the worst possible way, and I've been paying for that mistake every day since. She took a shaky breath before continuing. I'm not here asking for forgiveness. I don't deserve that. I'm here because I need help getting away from him, and you're the only person who might truly understand what's happening. Everyone else is completely under his spell, just like I was. Caitlin explained that she had been secretly saving small amounts from household money, but it would take months to accumulate enough for even temporary housing. Jackson monitored her whereabouts through her phone and insisted on knowing her schedule at all times. This trip to Seattle had required an elaborate cover story about visiting a college friend who was willing to corroborate if checked. I know I have no right to ask anything of you, she concluded, but I didn't know where else to turn. As she spoke, I experienced a dizzying mix of emotions. Vindication that my perceptions of Jackson had been accurate, residual anger at her betrayal, and unwanted concern for her well-being. The woman before me was simultaneously the person who had broken my heart and someone clearly in distress. The irony of her seeking help from the man she had abandoned was not lost on either of us. For 3 days following our meeting, I wrestled with conflicting emotions and responsibilities. Part of me wanted to dismiss Caitlin's problems as karmic justice, to tell her she had made her bed and must now lie in it. Another part recognized the familiar patterns of abuse she described and felt a human obligation to help someone in genuine distress, regardless of our history. I scheduled an emergency session with Dr. Torres to help navigate this unexpected ethical dilemma. You're facing a complex situation with no perfect solution, she acknowledged. The question isn't whether Caitlin deserves your help. That's not for you to judge. The question is what boundaries you need to maintain for your own well-being while deciding what, if anything, you're willing to do. This framework helped clarify my thinking. I could not insert myself directly into Caitlin's situation without risking my own hard-won stability and potentially re-entering the toxic family dynamic I had escaped. However, I could connect her with resources better equipped to help her than I was. I contacted a former colleague whose sister worked with a domestic violence resource center, explaining the situation in general terms. She provided information about services available in Chicago, including legal assistance, housing options, and counseling, specifically designed for situations involving psychological control and manipulation. When I called Caitlin from a private number to share these resources, I maintained clear boundaries. I'm sending you information that can help you create an exit plan safely, I explained. But I cannot and will not be directly involved in the situation. For both our sakes, this needs to be the extent of my assistance. Her gratitude was palpable, though tinged with obvious disappointment. I understand, she said quietly. Thank you for doing even this much. You would have every right to ignore me completely. No one deserves to feel trapped or controlled, I replied. But my involvement ends with providing these resources. You need to work with professionals who can help you safely extract yourself from this situation. After ending the call, I blocked the temporary number she had used to contact me, a necessary step to maintain the boundary I had established. I had done what basic human decency required, nothing more or less. 2 weeks later, an unfamiliar Chicago number appeared on my phone. Against my better judgment, I answered. It was Jackson, his voice tight, with barely controlled rage. "I hope you're satisfied," he spat without preamble. "Your little revenge plot worked. Caitlin's gone." I maintained a neutral tone, unwilling to be drawn into his drama. I simply provided information about resources available to anyone who feels unsafe in their relationship. "She was fine until you filled her head with nonsense," he shouted. "We were happy you couldn't stand that she chose me, so you poisoned her against me." "Is that what you told our parents?" I asked calmly, recognizing the familiar pattern of narrative control. His momentary hesitation confirmed my suspicion. "They understand that you've always been jealous of me. They know you manipulated Caitlin because you couldn't accept losing." "I'm sure that's what they believe," I replied. "It's what they've always believed. But we both know the truth, Jackson. We always have." Before he could respond, I ended the call and blocked his number. For the first time in our lives, I had refused to play my assigned role in his narrative. The liberation I felt transcended any lingering hurt or resentment. Later that week, I received an email from a generic account containing only 2 sentences: "I'm safe. Thank you." I didn't respond, but I saved the message as a reminder that sometimes doing the right thing doesn't require grand gestures or personal involvement. Just the courage to set appropriate boundaries while still acknowledging our shared humanity. My parents predictably took Jackson's version of events as gospel. An email from my mother expressed deep disappointment in my interference in my brother's marriage, suggested therapy for my unresolved jealousy issues, and implied that my continued estrangement was now my choice rather than theirs. I archived the email without response, recognizing it as the final confirmation that nothing had changed in their perceptions, and nothing likely would. This clarity, though painful, was ultimately freeing. I could finally release the hope that my family would someday recognize the dynamics that had shaped our relationships. I could stop seeking validation from people unwilling or unable to provide it. I could build a life based on my values rather than reactions to their treatment. In the months that followed, I committed more deeply to my own healing and growth. I expanded my photography beyond architecture to include landscape work that took me to remote areas of the Pacific Northwest. I accepted a teaching position at a local community college, sharing my architectural knowledge with enthusiastic students. I cautiously began dating again, with a much clearer understanding of healthy relationship dynamics. The greatest change, however, was internal. The constant need for external validation that had driven so many of my choices had diminished. The compulsion to prove my worth, especially to my family, had lost its power. I began to recognize my inherent value independent of others' perceptions or approval. 6 months after Caitlin's departure from my brother's life, I received a small package at my office. Inside was a set of cufflinks I had admired years ago but never purchased, accompanied by a note in familiar handwriting. "You once mentioned wanting these. Consider it a very small repayment on a debt I can never fully repay. I am building a new life in Arizona. I hope you continue building yours in peace. Thank you for helping me find my courage." I donated the cufflinks to a local charity auction, supporting domestic violence resources. The cycle of our connection was complete, and we had both found our separate paths forward. Today, my life bears little resemblance to what I had planned with Caitlin. I recently accepted a partnership at my firm, completed my first solo gallery showing of architectural photography, and have been dating someone who appreciates me for exactly who I am rather than who she might shape me to become. I maintain minimal contact with my parents, engaging only to the extent that feels healthy for me rather than from obligation. Jackson, I hear, has remarried already, someone from his professional circle who my parents apparently adore. The pattern continues, but I am no longer caught in its web. Caitlin, according to her social media that occasionally appears in mutual connections feeds, seems to be thriving in her new location, having returned to curatorial work at a small but respected gallery. The most valuable lesson from this painful chapter was learning that sometimes family is defined by shared values and mutual respect rather than shared DNA. The betrayal that once seemed like the end of my world became instead the beginning of authentic freedom from toxic patterns I might otherwise have continued indefinitely. Have you ever found yourself caught in a family dynamic where you were consistently cast as the villain in someone else's heroic narrative? Have you experienced that moment when you finally recognized your worth wasn't determined by those who refused to see you clearly? Share your experience in the comments below. Your insight might help someone else recognize and break free from similar patterns. If this story resonated with you, please like, subscribe, and share with others who might benefit from knowing they aren't alone in these struggles. Thank you for joining me on this journey, and remember that sometimes losing what you thought you wanted opens the door to discovering what you truly need.